Welcome, everyone. We're at the BMRC 2025 False Fellow Speaker Series today. We have joining us Doctors Eric Peterson and Catherine Fennell to discuss Dr. Peterson's research done this summer. Uh, and I will Greenlining the Ghetto, Housing, Rehabilitation, and Black Power Politics. Dr. Peterson works as a labor organizer and researcher in the Bay Area. His research centers on the politics of home ownership, tenancy, race, and the built environment. As a BMRC short-term fellow in 2016 and in 2025, he examined the history of efforts to increase working class ownership of housing in majority Black neighborhoods in Chicago. From the 1960s to the 1980s, he holds a PhD in architecture from the University of California, Berkeley. Our discussant today is Dr. Catherine Fennell, the Associate Professor at the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University. Catherine Fennell is an urban anthropologist jointly appointed in the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Her research explores how the legacies of 20th century urbanism shape contemporary politics of social difference, collective responsibility, and urban transformation in the United States, with a focus on subsidized housing and changing built environments. Her award-winning book, The Last Project Standing, received the 2016 Book Prize from the Association of Political and Legal Anthropology. And that's, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Finn was also a BMRC fellow and doing some of that research. So we're doubly proud to have both of you all
Great.
here.
Yeah.
So I will just give a brief background on the BMRC. We are a consortium of now expanding consortium of 28 libraries, archives, and museums around the Chicago area. And we seek to connect all those who are interested in documenting and sharing and understanding Black experiences in the Chicago area. This is just some of our latest roster of members. And the 2025 Summer Short-Term Fellows continues in the legacy of our short-term Summer Research Fellowship, which was begun in 2009. We have more than 130 fellowships that have been awarded. We also have more than 30 books that have been published by BMRC Fellows. Of course, there are a lot more articles. There's some plays, books of poetry. So we're very proud of the contribution the fellows have been able to make. We'd like to call everyone's attention to our upcoming 20th anniversary symposium on Black Chicago, and the call for papers for that is open now, and that will be taking place next summer. Also encourage anyone who would like to support the BMRC's initiatives, for instance, paying for the fellows and the stipends that are given to do this research. We appreciate anything that can be given to help us continue this work. And now I'd like to remind people of our next talk, which will take place on November 6th with a fellow from the summer, Martha Patterson, who will be discussing ebony and the polarization of Pan-African consciousness. But without further ado, I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Eric Peterson.
Okay, great. Thank you for your patience, and thank you, Sumaya and Tolu and Catherine for helping set this up. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion. So I'll probably be pretty quick, not linger too much on the presentation, because I think that yeah, because I am looking forward to the discussion. So in the late 1960s, Black Americans in many inner city neighborhoods across the US revolted against ghettoized living conditions in their neighborhoods. Labor markets were still heavily segregated, but increasing numbers of Black and white workers in these cities labored side by side. At the heart of enduring segregation was that once they clocked out of work, most white workers returned to a home they owned, while most African Americans were consigned to live predominantly as tenants in slum housing that landlords treated as a cash cow. Many viewed Chicago as ground zero of residential segregation in the industrial North, and the city became a hotbed of experimentation to undo its grip. Chicago's industrial and residential neighborhoods were sites throughout the 20th century of experiments in reordering built landscapes to reflect changing economic logics. The uprising signals discontent with segregation and specifically with processes of disinvestment and profit extraction in Black neighborhoods. And so I opened with one example, and a couple of us were mentioning, the idea of urban uprisings a minute ago, and I think it's important to also like give another example, which is of the phenomena I'm talking about, which is also uh, the phenomena of like building arson that was happening at the time, which recently historians like Bench Ainsfield have shown are instances of landlords looking to reap the profit to be made from their insurance. And so that's, I think we really fixate on things like the late 60s uprising in Chicago after the death of Martin Luther King, and also redlining, which I will talk a bit about in a moment. But I just want to give, another example of the type of um, phenomena in the area that sort of signaled the failure to confront what was happening in terms of the disinvestment and extraction in neighborhoods on the south and west side of Chicago. Um, and in this talk, I'm going to, like I said, talk a little bit about redlining and about some of the organizing to contest to halt, the process of neighborhoods becoming slums. But I'm also going to transition to talking about the more recent research I did this summer, which focuses on the efforts of civic leaders, community activists, and philanthropists in the 70s and 80s to create a new logic of investment in slum housing um, in the city's Black neighborhoods. And one way I've been working with thinking about the transition from an earlier era of urban renewal to uh, the neoliberal policies that followed it are to think about the concept of rehab between the two eras, and as it evolved from one priority of civil rights organizing into a dominant strategy pursued by local and federal officials in a later moment. Um, and so to begin with the historical aspect, Black residents on the Woodlawn, I'm focusing on in my research has focused on the Woodlawn neighborhood in the south side of Chicago. And in many ways, I'm going to be focusing on Woodlawn and the Woodlawn organization, which was emblematic of community organizing in the 60s and 70s. Residents came to understand themselves as subject to processes overseen by real estate agents and landlords who enforce the color line as a means of reaping profit. This phenomenon was enabled by redlining, which meant that conventional mortgage lending was not being made in these neighborhoods. As a result, landlords and homeowners couldn't access conventional mortgages, and housing stock quickly degraded as owners, quote, milked their buildings in order to recoup losses on the buildings. And in this process, they charged tenants exorbitant rates. Um, and Woodlawn was among the Southside neighborhoods most impacted. And over the course of the 1970s, the neighborhood lost more than 20% of its housing stock. And as in many other Chicago neighborhoods, just to note, it had a mixture of small and large apartment buildings as well as single family homes. Thinking about the urban renewal era, this is an image of a plan to redevelop Woodlawn, and to redevelop Woodlawn, and it depicts it's representative of the approach of slum clearance that was undertaken at mid-century. You can see the neighborhood here below the University of Chicago and next to Jackson Park, and declaring that a majority of the buildings were dilapidated, deteriorating, or lacking plumbing facilities and in need of redevelopment. And this had been the main approach through which officials worked to halt the development of slums after redlining happened, or as part of redlining. And then, yeah, so this image really depicts that, as well as this image, also a plan from the plan to redevelop Woodlawn. And this approach posed buildings and neighborhoods as obsolete, and followed the idea that buildings have a lifespan that can be exhausted. And so the goal of urban renewal in this way was to restore property values through their replacement. As described by architectural historian Daniel Abramson, this obsolescence paradigm viewed buildings as commodities, as part of a Fordist model of economy of the built environment. And by the 1960s, this conception of urban change, specifically the heavy toll that it exacted on displaced Black residents, was heavily contested, and civil rights and community activists were probing for alternatives to this model of redevelopment. And so turning to the Woodlawn organization, so focusing on the Woodlawn organization, um, it was an early community development corporation founded by local Pentecostal pastor Arthur Brazier, and it utilized connections with outside philanthropists and through the organizer Saul Alinsky to try to set up an alternative model of redevelopment to the clearance that was being proposed of Woodlawn. And they focused as part of a model cities approach to they were seeking funding from the model cities program under LBJ. They emphasized a whole person approach to renewal. And TW's efforts themselves provide a useful reference point, I'm arguing, for understanding the transition from the welfare state or urban renewal model to the neoliberal policies that would subsequently be adopted in the 1970s. And in my reading of their plans, TW's and other community activists embraced rehabilitation as part of their efforts to reform urban renewal. And this was a pragmatic strategy on their part to resist wholesale condemnation of their neighborhood by outside institutions. But importantly, they also sought government funding not just for rehab, but at the same time that they were pursuing funds for large-scale redevelopment that included things like public housing, social service centers, and grocery stores. And so this is an image from their alternative plan for a housing, but also mixed use development called Woodlawn Gardens that I'll talk more about in a second. And so I'm interested in TW's plans in part because they were part of a larger civil rights movement which sought to use state interventions to redress past harm of urban renewal in both housing and employment markets, and with the New Deal more generally. Urban League Chairman Whitney Young and UAW President Walter Reuther called for a Marshall Plan for American cities as part of the next phase of the civil rights movement. With government, the idea behind the Marshall Plan to counter the disinvestment that had happened in urban housing markets as a result of redlining. And or investment in the suburbs more generally. They didn't necessarily like identify redlining as, the reason for wanting this investment, but on a local level, they were targeting federal funds that were meant to go towards urban renewal development. And TW, for instance, was very clear in their federal funding that they were seeking, that they were going to use it for construction projects that were carried out only by Black-owned construction firms or that employed majority Black workforce. And so I'll return to the Woodlawn Gardens project in a moment, but just thinking about this idea of rehab, in the 1960s, it was growing in use as a tactic in the repertoire of urban renewal, as these plans commissioned by a Chicago foundation demonstrate. These are from the mid-1960s. They depict upgrading of select residential blocks as part of a more comprehensive scheme, in the way that some of the diagrams we just saw from the slum clearance of the proposal for the clearance of Woodlawn. And so there is like continuity in terms of this approach of thinking about redevelopment more comprehensively, but shifting more to rehab being one strategy that that people wanted to pursue. And in this plan, which is drawn up by architect Stanley Tigerman, we see a whole block systematically redesigned, where a vacant lot and alleyway are replaced with open green space. Rehabilitating older housing in this way had a precedence. Some of the city's wealthier white neighborhoods, like Hyde Park, had since the 1950s undergone conservation campaigns with the goal of maintaining their racial and class composition. Abramson notes that from the 1960s onward, obsolescence was falling out of favor as the logic behind these redevelopments, and blight was overtaking it. And so I'm suggesting rehabilitation is part of that process of which we're moving away, planners were moving away from obsolescence and towards a more a different metaphor, in this case, biologically or medically informed. Two hired Tigerman, who was a Yale-trained architect but Chicago native, to design Woodlawn Gardens, following the work that he had done for the Marymount Foundation, which was also a sponsor of Woodlawn Gardens, and also following Tigerman's work for the Chicago Housing Authority to develop low-rise housing typologies. And these are like information dense drawings that he made for them, but they're basically making an argument for moving away from high-rise development of public housing towards what he saw as more flexible and experimental ideas of low-rise housing. This was, I think, can also be seen as a common like funding scheme, or an approach to get funds through new HUD programs at the time, which is definitely part of what's at play with Woodlawn Gardens. Moving to that project now, you can see clearly like the influence of his work trying to move towards like assembling a larger site out of properties, but like in an incisive way and not wholesale redevelopment of multiple blocks. And the renderings for Woodlawn Gardens, where it's been emphasized uh by by Tigerman and subsequent historians like Marissa Angel Brown, have focused on how there was an attempt on Tigerman's effort to make the low-rise housing appeal more towards a homeowner sensibility, even though these were rental units, and emphasizing the importance between like the user in the building and folks on the street, and the emphasis on like individual units. So thinking more about rehab as not just about redevelopment, two Tigerman's office worked with two to create and staff an architecture clinic, which was geared towards homeowners to rehab properties themselves. As described by Tigerman and Brazier, the clinic would have the purpose of allowing, they had a utopian idea of trying to train Black residents to eventually become architects themselves. And on a more pragmatic level, they were focused on allowing homeowners to undertake rehab projects themselves. Brazier said of this goal, quote, "Woodlawn has block after block of basically sound buildings where small homeowners can do their own improvements if they have expert help." And Woodlawn Gardens, just like to put a epigraph on the Woodlawn Gardens development project, it was funded, like as I mentioned, through new HUD programs that subsidized developments by nonprofit groups, but quickly faced difficulty making mortgage payments, which was a common issue faced by many similar projects that were also funded by the HUD program. And it was eventually foreclosed upon by HUD. And subsequently, Woodlawn Gardens has been redeveloped. The incident this incident reflects how community groups like to working to reverse residential segregation in the late 1960s and 1970s were beset by a rapidly changing political economy. The assumptions that they were working under around reforming mid-century development were often running aground of the realities of that changing political economy. And so now turning from the example of two, in the second half of this, I'm going to be emphasizing what happens after 1973. 1973 is when President Nixon issued a moratorium on new federal housing subsidies, which was a death knell for the kind of approach two was pursuing. As Boston Mayor Raymond Flynn remarked, quote, "The national policy we have now is no policy at all." And so this effectively ended the era of using federal subsidies in this way, as part of, a larger slum clearance strategy. Following the moratorium, rehab remained one of the few pragmatic tools to stem the slum process. In this context, community groups like two cobbled together individual grants from philanthropists and government agencies to restore some number of homes and apartment buildings. In 1981, the Chicago Rehab Network, a newer umbrella group for the city's CDCs, again, community development corporations, described that in its first 5 years, its 43 member groups had serviced only 2,000 units. Between 1970 and 1980, Woodlawn alone had lost 5,400 units, with the city overall losing 61,000 units. And so in the remainder of my time, I'm going to be talking about the use of rehab as part of a more experimental phase, or looking at a variety of proposals that were meant to allow rehab to take over fully from the slum clearance project in many ways. And I'm interested in specifically in how these proposals work to replace the Fordist logic of urban renewal with a very different envisioning of urban environments, and also of the labor that would produce these environments. So in 1984, a group of Chicago officials gathered together as the Housing Abandonment Task Force, completed a 2-year study focusing on stemming blight and noting that rehabbing structures while they were still occupied was much more cost effective than any alternative process. And the report singled out loans made from local banks to CDCs as the most promising solution towards scaling up the problem of a lack of funding for rehabs to take place. This led to they led the group to make a recommendation that bankers invest equity capital in smaller projects, allowing them over time to recoup loans paid from the income streams on completed rehabs. 3 members of the task force were program officers in the Chicago office of the Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC, a national nonprofit founded in 1980 by the Ford Foundation in concert with 6 private insurance, banking, and industrial firms. The officers used the idea from the task force to create the Chicago Equity Fund, which in its inaugural year of 1986 was able to invest $6.6 million in 14 CDCs who were rehabbing 530 units of housing in that year. And this flowchart shows like who the first investors were, and then the money funneling through the equity fund towards the CDCs working on rehab. And the novelty of the fund, I'll mention briefly, was in the tax benefits that it gave to the investors. And it promised to allow them a 15% annual return. The success of the syndication aspect in particular, was in how it created a secondary market, or a pool for selling the tax incentive to investors, ensuring that they were insulated from losses on individual buildings and therefore guaranteed a return. What made the fund attractive and ensured enough demand for enough financing for a larger volume was this guarantee that they wouldn't have a loss. And within short order, the success of the equity fund was then replicated by LISC in creating a national version of the financing model. And so the financing model is a focus of a lot of these early proposals around rehab. And one aspect in my research that I think is under commented on is the contingent arrangements of labor that were associated with different proposals. I think revisiting these considerations can raise important questions about who the process of rehabilitation is meant to serve. For instance, one group obtained funding under a Department of Labor program with the explicit goal of creating unionized jobs for minority workers. The group was able to pair these federal funds with a training program by a local trade union, allowing for, quote, previously unemployed, economically disadvantaged young men and women to be recruited through the Illinois Job Service. and in the process rehabilitating at least 16 single-family homes in Inglewood, Illinois. And yet another variation on the idea, and these newspaper clippings, I'm just also interested in the narrative that's made between the homes and the workers who are working on them. And to cite a different proposal along these lines, in the late 80s, Mayor Harold Washington's administration was considering a proposal from an outfit named Urban Revitalization of America, or URI, which also utilized laid off workers, in this case, auto workers, as trainees on rehab projects in several other cities. It originated in Detroit and Flint. The executive director of Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, or COCO, a CDC named after the South Side neighborhood of the same name, urged Washington staff to meet with URI, and he noted that the organization touted a really high, a 90% job placement rate, and had completed 10,000 rehab projects in multiple different cities. And the goal of this project was swapping out a post-industrial workforce into another line of well-paying blue-collar work, but it also had a financial logic in the sense that profits realized from the rehab homes were envisioned as being shared with the trainees who were unpaid for the duration of the time they were working on these projects. Um, and I haven't fully established like what happened with this proposal in Chicago in particular, but my hint of why it necessarily didn't go forward is there was some conflict with the Washington administration over it, and COCO's executive director was already worried about the longer term impacts when he wondered, quote, will the housing program proposed by URI gentrify the neighborhoods? And this was the right question to ask, given that URI's intentions did seem focus explicitly on developing a for-profit model of rehab. My initial observation of this history is that in the absence of larger federal funding, rehab was excised from a larger agenda of the urban civil rights movement, or it was either excised from that agenda, or we can say it was reconceived as a much narrower, small-scale technique of urban triage. And sweat equity in particular held out the promise of undertaking rehab on a much tighter budget. A 1979 proposal by the Rehab Network for a smaller demonstration project, again, a different demonstration project, argued for the concept as has successfully been deployed in Harlem by the New York City Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, or UHAB. The proposal defines sweat equity as, quote, combining user participation in construction and or the management of completed properties. It is expected that sweat equity, the proposal argued, can write down construction costs by approximately 10% and a similar amount in terms of management. So I'm just going to mention one more. This is one of the early apartment buildings that was being rehabbed by Lisk's fund. I'm going to mention one more of these novel proposals in line with the idea of the need to create a new model, a new financing model. And one that I came across was articulated by a recent graduate of an MBA program who approached community groups with a novel financing scheme. He, in his vision for the financing, saw laborers who would build their own homes and trading wages for a discounted purchasing price. The new single-family homes and apartment buildings would be funded through tax-exempt bonds issued by the city. A housing analyst at the Chicago Urban League replied that he found the idea gratuitous and offensive, where it assumed that those who might participate in such a program, which was also described at one point as a job training venture, he found it offensive that the assumption that they would be able to buy their own homes through this program. In an extensive reply, the Urban League analyst wrote, quote, there are many non-financial questions not answered here. Most of them have to do with the people. What is the goal of this proposal, jobs or housing? And I mentioned this proposal in the context of the others in the sense that it was so abstracted, and here's some images just of, again, more of these diagrams about how the financing would work. And this proposal in particular is so abstracted from the problem, the housing problem it was purported to address. But as with Lisk's tax syndication fund, The proposal, in my reading, existed to fill a vacuum of a lack of funding, and for many, the problem of and the solution to Chicago's housing problem lay in the creation of a workable financial model. In reflecting on these proposals, I'm conscious at this stage of the research of my lack of understanding in some ways of some of the larger processes, maybe not larger, more granular processes that was driving rehab on the ground. To cite an example of this that I'm interested in looking into at the future, one article describes an apartment building in the South Austin neighborhood where the owner was delinquent on taxes on the building and the city took over the property, which was likely common because in a study conducted in Harlem, found that by 1980, the city owned 65% of all property in Harlem. So this was likely a problem in Chicago too. And it created certain questions around ownership. For instance, this one building in South Austin, it was left up to the residents to basically upkeep the building themselves so it would not be condemned, and involved them going to court to like contest different code violations and try to demonstrate that they were able to upkeep it. As one of the occupants said, quote, "Since the building doesn't have a real owner, we're facing the possibility that after we get the building rehabilitated, an investor may then come in and buy the taxes on it and then, benefit from the work that they had put into rehabbing the building themselves." And I think this cycle of ownership, I'm interested in part, and again, this is like a speculative idea on my part, in how we see residents sort of creating the logic of flipping that has, becomes fairly ubiquitous in how we talk about housing today. And moving to conclude, I'm interested in thinking about building rehab as described in these proposals as reflecting a changing approach to urban housing that moved in some ways beyond the obsolescence paradigm, which called for replacement of slum housing as the main way to restore value. Instead, in one sense, rehab posed housing as an asset for outsiders to benefit from as an investment opportunity. But rehab also, thinking about it another way, it also posed affordable housing in the way we see it today, which is in some ways a social service, and in that it provides a service to those who live in it, but also who work to restore it, offering them a skill. More, which I've mostly talked about that idea critically, but I'm still thinking about it. And I think that cultivating assets as envisaged as a pragmatic way to stem abandonment came about in the absence of social welfare spending, and as a means, as a vacuum of other political ideas around how to further stave off the alienation happening in these neighborhoods. The project was not driven primarily by anti-government conservatives or real estate investments, as histories of neoliberalism give to us. Instead, it was driven by policymakers and philanthropists, namely officials connected to the Ford Foundation, which I did not mention, but was, a heavy investor in too as well, and early efforts to get CDCs off the ground. These policymakers rushed to support the incorporation of CDCs and create funding models for them as a way of steering the widespread alienation with the disinvestment in these neighborhoods away from more antagonistic responses to the urban crisis. I mean, this is the common critique of the foundation's role in Black Power politics. More specifically, many of the demonstration projects for rehabilitation in and around Chicago worked to manage the consequences of rather than challenge the underlying dynamics of ongoing urban disinvestment. The federal moratorium forced CDCs from a more expansionist vision of urban rehab to one limited to self-help. As sociologist Mary Patillo argues, community groups' success came from their ability to cultivate entrepreneurial capacities to attract funds from outside investors. In her study of Kenwood, Oakland in the 2000s, she notes that the CDC COCO used federal tax credits where they, in the model created by LISC through the tax syndication, and how she notes that COCO played a role in some ways in the gentrification of the process when where it demonstrated the success of housing projects to outside private investors. Like again, modeling, which was the goal of many of these demonstration projects, was like modeling a viable financial model. In some, tracing the evolution of urban rehab into a form of triage raises questions about the failure to realize more structural political interventions, which had been called for by civil rights activists, and how these failures shape ongoing racial inequalities in Chicago and cities like it. And I think tracing this history also highlights continuities of disinvestment and extraction, and how the failure to redeflect some of these flows of investment in and out of the neighborhood, how these flows set the term for how revitalization takes shape and to whose benefit. So those are my prepared remarks, and yeah, I appreciate you all joining me to think through some of these. And Professor Fennell, if you, I know we had talked about a couple of questions, if you wanted to
Sure.
pick it up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Peterson. And I just want to thank Samaya again, because I was an early fellow of the BMRC, and it did allow me to do some important archival work that helped me rethink my dissertation and think more carefully about legal cases that were critical to the trajectory of housing politics in Chicago, but also beyond Chicago. So it's a really important organization, and I'm so excited to be here, to be back here to talk about this great work. And to see these slides more carefully. I just want to say just two things for some general remarks or questions. I think that people get into housing studies because they are interested in the concreteness of housing, right? Which, you know, Eric's presentation definitely brought out, right? There are really concrete issues that come to whether or not a building can stand, let alone catch fire, all this sort of stuff. But a really critical part of the story in the late 20th century into the 21st is the question of financing, right? And to see careful work on financing, which can be hard to understand. I mean, I got into anthropology because I don't do the numbers, right? It's a kind of embarrassing admission, but you know, we don't really do the numbers. It's so critical for understanding how things get built. And I just want to just stress this because now we are in a new housing crisis, right? Every 10 years, we tend to have a housing crisis. This latest one, which is being encapsulated in progressive circles as the abundance argument, Ezra Klein, this kind of stuff. They pose questions like, what happened to all the houses? Oh, they were never built because of bad regulation. What would happen if we put other things on the table, as in they were never built because actually they were disinvested and they fell down, or they were never built because a financing model couldn't be operated, right? So there are very important questions that come to the table when we think about the relationship between finance, the financialization of housing, and the concreteness of it, whether or not it can stand. And I think that Eric's work is putting pressure on some really facile conversations that are circulating in housing politics these days about just deregulate. So that is the stakes of this kind of work. Careful work on financialization will help us push back on the argument that we just need less regulation in order to build, baby, build. So I just want to be clear that this is very important work. Okay, so I have some general questions. And Samaya, you can cut me off when you want to open it up, because again, I'm very excited about this work and could talk about it. So the first question I have is that it's been really great as someone who works on housing over the past decade to see a lot of young people interested and conversant in the language of redlining, what it was, what happened, what it does, right? And so this is very exciting, and not just young people showing up in my classes, but activists on the ground in Chicago and other cities. And this is, of course, not news to older people who lived through this, but it's really exciting to see this younger energy in this history of what has happened to our cities. However, not so common is the language of greenlining. And I'm wondering, Dr. Peterson, if you could talk about this term. You know, the contrast between redlining and greenlining. As I understand it, greenlining is more coming out of West Coast housing activism. So it's really exciting to see a regional transference here of the way you're thinking. But I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the difference between the two and what approaching a historical study through the lens of greenlining brings that perhaps you can't quite get with redlining.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah. And for the general comments. It's very helpful. I think from a perspective the historical archive, I should mention that greenlining did not come up in this research. And so that does pose questions about how I'm using it. I mean, to my mind, I think greenlining, I'm thinking about it, it is used by both groups. It is used, or it is used by multiple groups. And so that's why, I mean, it does raise an interesting question around, like I know of at least one historian who is choosing not to use greenlining because it is used by the capitalists as a solution. And it's meant to be, I mean, it's used by activists and capitalists who are both have a shared interest in expanding financial inclusion to formerly disinvested groups. And I think I'm still thinking through how to frame that, because I am using it in part to draw attention to like the speculative nature of it, in terms of the assumption that if you swap out one kind of model of redevelopment with another, oftentimes, as you were saying, swap out the government with public, or I'm sorry, swap out public government action with private investment, that it will fix the problem, because this is, like you're saying, a reoccurring assumption about what is happening. And it's, you know, it has a long history, is like, is the it becomes, yeah, I become really interested in like the political utility of that idea, because it just, or like why it happens recurrently. And so to my mind, I'm trying to draw attention to the assumptions that going from red to green would be would like fix the problem, when it clearly has not, did not, starting you know, with the HUD Act of 1968, as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book really talked about, and does, you know, has failed in subsequent decades. And I mean, one way, I agree with you about the salience that redlining as a metaphor has had. And unfortunately, I do think it has a bit to do with the Richard Rothstein book about the color of law, and which is cited constantly in the deregulation approach. And you know, I think it's important to revisit how activists like thought of redlining, because they did not see it as primarily a government, or they had a very clear understanding of like banking practices and real estate practices that are sometimes obscured in how people talk about it today. And yeah, and just like one last thing on it is like, I mentioned Bench Ansfield's work on arson, and was thinking about this because I heard an interview that they did, that where they are using the term brown lining to combine red and green, in terms of like it is increasing access but still is discriminatory. So like a way of, that's like another way of trying to think about what happens, you know, after redlining was Rebecca Marcial's title for it. Like I think people are still grappling, at least in the historical field, with how to talk about it.
Yeah, great. That's really helpful. Because yeah, I did understand greenlining not to be a kind of local term on the ground, but that it was a really helpful conceptual tool. That I think you're putting pressure on the assumption that if you simply flip the situation, right, make capital flood in, make it available through private means, and this will solve the problem, as if capital is also not guided by particular kinds of, you know, interests and that kind of thing. So of course, if it's up to private financiers, they're not going to invest in particular neighborhoods until it becomes profitable for them to do that. And this bridge to having sweat equity to like make that happen, to make it an attractive investment. I mean, it's really an interesting push to think about how some of these discriminations could be repeated, even with the availability of capital and the lessening of regulation, which is what's being called for and has been called for again and again over the decades. Okay, helpful. Okay. Yes. My second question is kind of tied to what we've already talked about, so maybe I'll skip it in favor of the question of design, right? Because you asked me to think about that. I was surprised. You asked me to think about the Woodlawn organization's design for Woodlawn Gardens, that it was a kind of departure from what they understood or what people understood to be the high-rise model of public housing. And in its description, I did not see that departure as much, right? I thought this actually looked quite a lot like, for instance, I spent a lot of time working in buildings that no longer exist, but for instance, the Horner Annex right by the United Center had a kind of internal townhouse model, right? It's mid-rise, right? So the idea that there were 2 stories between a household and one story is the street, right? You see this also in the Jane Addams homes. You see this in the Cabrini townhomes. Many of these buildings are not there anymore, but they do have an earlier iteration of this kind of townhome type model. And also this idea that people were developing or aimed to develop the whole person as opposed to kind of more functionalist housing. Again, you know, CHA plans are rife with this discussion, right? The daycare, the grocery program, the gardening program, right? So I'm wondering, you know, at first I was like, well, perhaps there's more continuity that has been overstated, that there's a difference between these kinds of interventions in design. But perhaps, you know, the question is more, why would it have been useful to overstate the difference at that time? Why would there need to be a departure in design, given that there were, you know, even in the high-rise public housing projects, even the design of the elevators to stop on different floors was meant to replicate a smaller block of people, right? So if you get off on this floor, you're going to see the same families all the time, right? The same households. So it's interesting to me that this maybe is just, as you suggested, that Tigerman needed to establish a departure, but there are continuities. So what would an argument for departure be doing at that time?
Yeah, no, I think that's like, I think that's really right, because the more I like try to contextualize some of the statements being made, the more it does seem like there's an effort to draw a binary of, this is how we were doing things before and this is how we're doing things now. And um I mean, I think there's a really good there is a really good article that does contrast I'm sorry, that I'm spacing on the designer of the Hilliard homes is the guy who made Marina City. Oh my God, uh
Ormond is there too, which is really bad. Not
um
actual historians.
I
What's his name?
yeah.
Oh, hold on. I'll get it.
Alf Goldberg. Yeah, Goldberg. Yeah, and there's a really good article by the Marissa Angel Brown article, really contrasts the model that was used in terms of like, I think it has a lot to do with how the architects talked about their work, which was like a focus on the like Goldberg was really focused on like this idea of reforming the subjects through the design of the building, whereas Tigerman had a real focus on like, he wasn't the author, he was co-creating this with people and he was just like observing what they wanted, which was I think a lot of I mean, having had to work in architecture school for a long time, I think a lot of it has to do with like a rationalization of what you're doing. And because I think you're right, there are a fair amount of continuities, but I think that those examples do draw on at least like the difference of scale becoming really important, from the high rise to the low rise. And in Woodlawn's projects in particular, not just this one, there was a real focus on they're talking, they don't use the term, but like the eyes on the street idea, where people there's a real bias against people having to like not having a connection to the street and seeing the edges of the property. So there is something there, but I think you're right that there is a lot of continuity, and a lot of the difference does have to do with financing in some ways, because there's an obsession on the physical typology being a fix for a problem that isn't. And I think you noted this too in one of your questions, is like, it isn't about typology exclusively. Like, we can't blame these problems on design. But there was a persistent focus on wanting to do that. And so, yeah, there's a continuity between, the perceived the financing failure, as you pointed out in your comments to me earlier. And so there's a effort to like swap in, like a lot of it is just like, the LIHTC model that comes out of tax syndication. There are benefits that come to the financing model literally just because a private entity is holding the title versus the public entity, which is more highly regulated, it's like a projection of the abundance argument. But yeah, so I think you're right that the design aspect is more complex, and it does relate to efforts to try to like pinpoint like how can we make this work, even though there's continuities in the fact that if you shift to a nonprofit developer, they're still going to have the problem that there isn't enough the level of financing isn't enough to sustain what is happening on the ground in the same way that was happening with public housing projects.
Yes, same. Yeah, so many continuities. So I could talk about the alphabet soup of financing and some of the characters list. I mean, these are all still active and really important in rehab. But I thought if we open it up to the group and hear questions from everyone else.
Thank you both so much. If I can I have two questions. So if I could ask those while other people are thinking. First question is just, Eric, could you let us know? I know I saw you a lot this summer in the University of Chicago libraries, but which archives are really the most helpful for you for your research? And also, if you came across any records related to the decision to destroy neighborhoods to build the Dan Ryan Expressway in Chicago, because I know an artist who's really focusing on that, and just would be interested in knowing if you come across anything related to the building of the Dan Ryan.
Second question, really quickly, I have not encountered much about Dan Ryan. I think that would probably have to do, I think that was a slightly earlier time frame, but I'm not totally sure. But yeah, I think like the transportation angle is really, really interesting. One that people are doing more work around that I haven't really thought about. And to your other question about archives, the Urban League archive at UIC has been consistently helpful. There's just so much material. The Harold Washington archives are like as I move later in the historical record, were really helpful. And ironically, I found like randomly that there was a lot of good stuff about TWO, about two at Wayne State University in Detroit, because the Centers for Community Change, one of the Ford Foundation intermediaries, were located there. And I think a problem with the community groups that I'm finding is that their archives are either not publicly accessible or they're dispersed. And so it's like, oh, I came across a trove because of their funding was coming through this intermediary that has very good archival papers at Wayne State. But that was random in some ways, where I was like in Detroit and just was like, oh, let me see what's there. Art Institute, the Tigerman archives were just had visuals and not some of the written material that I don't know if it exists. And the two archives at the Chicago, I think I might have mentioned this, the TWO archives at the Chicago History Museum last time I was here were really, really helpful. And even though the processing of it was a little, well, anyways, yeah. So there's a question in the chat. Can you please speak more about the role of the Ford Foundation in the CDCs and responses to find solutions to housing? I mean, the main criticism of two is that that's even like acknowledged in like by Lisk and the Centers for the Centers for Community Change. What they mention is the criticism of two is that they very quickly shifted from community organizing to pragmatic service provision, because they were being encouraged to take over the urban renewal project, and they got involved in a very like heated battle with the Daley administration over accessing war on poverty funding, And yeah, I mean, I am interested in, I will mention just like really quickly that like there's, yeah, just there's like a whole interesting thing having to do with like two's relationship to the daily administration and to the people that they were trying to curry favor with. They had like a mixed relationship, and it's interesting to think about the role of their ability to challenge the power machine more directly when they were seeking like bond financing from Mayor Daley in a way that he had been using for decades. And that's something I'm still like thinking about. But I think that just the Ford Foundation, it really becomes like these are the main sources of funding. And they were able to get a lot of resources out of it. And so I think um, it becomes then questionable like how representative they are of the community interests. But I mean, this relates to a question that I was hoping to ask Professor Fennell, which is just like I did note that, well, I have like two questions, which is like I did note that you did I think you did work for a CDC at some point, or you were doing some work around that was facilitated as CDC, and I am just interested in your experience with that. And then a broader question is like, how do you view some of these debates about participation, and the shift from a welfare model of provision of services to one that is controlled by like community groups ostensibly? And yeah, I'm just curious.
That's a huge question. I'm happy to
Yeah.
go there. Yeah, I did volunteer quite heavily with a community development corporation that was tied to LISC, right? So years later, and was really, is still really pivotal in transforming the Near West Side, not just physically in terms of the reconstruction of demolished homes, some of which were subsidized and some which are not public housing, but also in the provision of social services, because that also was privatized. So there was a kind of idea that families in public housing had been social serviced, to exhaustion, and what they really needed was a kind of service connector. This is a kind of model that is coming through various kinds of philanthropic experiments, right? So Ford is really key in Chicago during recent, public housing reform. MacArthur is really key, right? Annie Casey is really key in Baltimore, but some of the experimental models they're producing are exported to other cities. So the story of big philanthropy, if you want to call it that, in the production of knowledge about urban design, but also urban transformation is really key. I guess, the thing I'll say about participation is that obviously it is a really important practice and people want to, maximize maximal feasible participation in how neighborhoods move, right? My concern in watching a lot of what has, the practice of community participation, what it's become in formal, planning, situations, is that it kind of becomes pro forma. It's become so institutionalized that there'll be a moment where the CDC or the local development corporation gives everyone in the room stickers and said, put a sticker on the design that you like the best. All right, check, we're done participation. We heard from everybody, right? So there is, again, it's a really important, more than a gesture, it's a really important demand coming out of the civil rights era, but it is subject to having its radical edge blunted through its institutionalization. And I promise if you go to any town meeting in any, area that sees a lot of influx of philanthropic money for redevelopment, for instance, the West Side, which I know a lot more about, you will see these moments of self-conscious participation, check, and then move on, right? So, does that mean you don't do participation, that you just leave it to experts and technocrats or, developers to lead us? No, but the question of how participation is done is really key. And I think there's room for pressure from activists who might want to argue for more meaningful participation, certainly for historians to track the different way that participation is institutionalized over time, right? The way that, signatures are collected at a door to do the check. We checked with the community, right? Check, 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 check. I saw a lot of that. It doesn't mean that there weren't good intentions, but that when it becomes subject to institutionalization and experts in community participation, you know, you see the kind of watering down of the process. And then it's more just like guiding particular community members to say particular things so that particular things can happen. It doesn't mean that it's not meaningful. And I don't mean to suggest it cynically. It's really important. Yet it is a practice and it is subject to more or less robustness. How about we say that? That's what I'll say as an anthropologist interested in practice. I would love to see more research on the ritual of community participation, especially around development. Another thing, perhaps, yeah, foundations really do mediate community participation. Yeah, yes, Ms. Black, that is exactly it. And so I don't know. I mean, does that mean that you don't have big philanthropy involved? Of course, there needs to be money to do this stuff, but the question is how, especially, I think this is a really key question now as federal and state funds are taxed further, right, and are less available. Philanthropies will be stepping in again for some kind of bridging. And the question is, what does philanthropic governance look like, especially in the realm of urban, but also rural policy right now? They're all still there. Ford, Annie Casey, Rockefeller, Mellon, they're all doing stuff. And it's not to say that they should stop. Like, these program officers are very committed to the work they do. The question is just how to think about on the ground what it does.
No, I was just going to say I attended a few things last week about philanthropy in Chicago, and one of the things that was brought up actually by a program officer at one of the larger foundations was, you know, just being honest. She said, you know, to whom are foundations accountable at the end of the day, and she thought, you know, because we can't really answer that in a real way, you know, they don't really have to, you know, everything is kind of based on their whims. It was an interesting discussion. I thought I would just share that. But I don't know, just for the sake of time, it'd be possible to take if there's any more questions from the members here on the line or between you all two, so that we could
So
wrap up.
I just have a quick one to add. It came out more in your presentation, really taken by the way that you picked up on the equivalence between rehabbing as a remediation term, rehabbing a building and rehabbing a body or subject, right? I just, you know, I am interested in that historical emergence. It is still really key in workforce development programs, right? You'll see them through a kind of component of a lot of philanthropic endeavors for urban engagement, that there'll be a workforce development component with the sense that the labor force needs itself to be rehab because it's somehow inadequate. I think that that's really important to think about how housing work and workforce development work, especially in Chicago, come together so cleanly. And there are a lot of potential in that, but there are also some questions. So I was really struck by that in your work.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's worth a lot more investigation, especially around like what I know a little bit, but not much, not enough to say much about the what's happening like in the construction industry at this time, and what's happening with urban construction, especially you know, like the move towards like smaller scale individual contractors versus like large. I mean, yeah, there's very interesting, like Melinda Cooper, it talks a lot about this in like more recent work, and just like the shift from like large unionized government contracts that were, you know, what to in some ways like what civil rights organizations were fighting for, was how do we desegregate these large government funded contracts, and thinking about like how Nixon cynically, you know, embraces affirmative action in part as a way of like breaking up the union because he's also defunding the large contracts. So it's like it's a really interesting shift that I haven't thought that much about, or that I'm like interested in exploring more. And I know less about the more current, the more present day, like what you're talking about with workforce development. So that is, you know, it's something that I'm like interested in the changes over time, but I don't yet know much about it.
Yeah, I encourage you to think about it, especially because it seems like the move, I don't want to say maneuver, it has a charge, but the move now is towards to solve the kind of missing middle in the affordable housing crisis is to move to modular housing forms, which presumably would involve even less workforce development, right? The workforce development programs are great, but they're usually limited. So you might have a job for a very short amount of time. The training you have for the job may not correspond to what you actually want to do. And the programs need to turn over as many people as possible for their trainees, right? So that's, there are limitations, of course, and potentials, but with this move to modular housing as a solution to our affordability housing crisis and the missing middle, that will be just restricted to the delivery. Most of the work will happen in the factory. And then that house, which is now automated, right? A lot of it is automated now. And then the house will be dropped down, right? You see this in Lawndale a lot now. And on the West Side especially. So I think this question of workforce development versus the relationship between workforce development and housing programs is interesting to think about and rethink at a moment of modular and on automation, especially.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's I just I guess last comment in relation to that, so we can let people go, is that's another recurring trend, is the idea that there's a HUD program in the late 60s called Project Breakthrough that was modular housing. And it comes up every now and then. People are like, well, there wasn't a breakthrough. But obviously, we're living several decades several decades of technological innovation. And so I think in some ways, I mean, we witness now poorly built new apartment buildings that are obviously shipping container model of design. So it is happening in a way that it hasn't happened in the past. But it is kind of this dream of cutting the labor cost to fix the housing crisis. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting one to think about. I will just mention really briefly is that there's a really good book do you know the Brett Sable book about I'll have to find the title, but basically arguing that basically just making a historical argument for why the deregulation agenda reappears reappears, and it happens in in response to, and same with Anthropes, I think, is in response to a lack of a political agenda that would challenge the status quo. And so you just have this vacuum where elites are trying to get buy-in consensus on the deregulation is a way that they get consensus from the elites, from local elites. It also is a way that they get buy-in from small homeowners because they create the alliance between the small homeowners and developers. That is in some ways, I think really crucial to understanding why tenants' rights are weak, And so just thinking about that political problem, I think, okay, the title is Illusions of Progress. But yeah, I found this book really helpful. I think, yeah, I don't want to keep folks much longer, but I have really enjoyed the conversation, and if it were up to me, I would talk about much more. But I really appreciate everyone's time and effort. If it makes sense to conclude.
Thank you so much. Just we really appreciate it. We would love to talk further, but I think we have a few other responsibilities, and but we will be having this posted online, and I obviously look forward to any kind of feedback that we get, and we'll share that with you all as well. Thank you both so much for joining us, and we will end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Having us.